You are listening to Readers and Writers, and we are back for season 2. And we're going to kick off our season talking about sequels and series. So, your host is James Hill and Athena Paris of RockHill. I'm Amy Ravichandran. We are just excited. So, you guys, talk to me about sequels and series. I get them mixed up all the time. I really do. I don't know what my problem is, but talk to me about it. Explain it for me.
Well, me and Athena were just having a discussion on that very fact. The difference between sequels and series. And first off, this is our second season, and we already knew we were going to do multiple seasons, of course. But I kind of like think of this as our sequel to season 1, because it's kind of an unplanned thing. When we were doing season 1, we were not planning what we were going to do in season 2. Just like we're not planning what we're going to do in season 3. So sequels are sort of like the unplanned that capitalize on the success of the other thing that you did. So like you wrote book 1 and people loved it. And now you say, hey, they love that book. I should do a second book. And so the second book is based on the first book, but you didn't really plan on it. A series is where you plan to do multiple books or multiple things. So you already know that you're going to do book 1 about this. You're going to have book 2 that's going to carry on about that. And you're going to do book 3 that's going to be somewhat tying all the things together, or however many books you have, series or elements of that series. So that's what I said. Athena, what was it that you were saying to me? Because you had a different view on it.
Well, I was saying that the difference between sequels and series is that the sequel is a narrative that you write after you had work. Now you created a different narrative within the same universe, and usually it's in a chronological order. So you just carry on building within the same story. So that's a sequel. And sometimes it can be about a different character, of course, depending. Whereas a series, we use the example of actually Star Wars, that the first 3 films were an entire story, and the second batch of stories was then a sequel to the first 3. So that was a sequel. Why? Because they knew people love the story so much. So they, like you said, capitalized on the success of the previous one. But now, so many years later, we actually have an entire series of Star Wars movies, because there's too many characters, so you want to follow their different lives, within the universe and everything. They're growing up, maturing and changing characters and all of that, and that is the difference.
Yeah. So basically, when you talk in series, you're usually tying it together a lot of time on characters or events. Like in the Star Wars universe, it's pretty much the event of the rise and fall of the Jedi. Okay. So you have different characters in between. Like you said, the first 3, it was pretty hard tied together to those characters and that storyline. And then with the big success, they went back and they did the prequel of how they became Jedi and all that kind of information. Love the Jedi movies. I grew up reading comics, mainly Marvel comics. And when you read the Marvel comic, they're all serialized. So you start off with one character, like Spider-Man or Iron Man, or one of these particular characters, and you start reading through that comic, and the events follow one after another, week after week, and they bring out these other characters that then will spin off into their own series and things. So Marvel made a tremendous success out of doing serials, because each comic will follow along that storyline, and then somewhere in that storyline, they spun off the next superhero or the next supervillain or something like that, that then took their story into a completely different direction in different series. So Marvel made a great success out of serializing and sequels of stories and characters that way too.
Yeah,
You see
they
that
call
now
that,
in the movies. Yeah.
what is that? That's called the multiverse, right? When they create all these different threads and all these opportunities and stuff. So, okay, that makes a lot more sense because I know
Yes.
looking back at that, go Athena.
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly, like, for example, if you look at I think it was 3, Ant-Man, they are sequels to each other. So it was a first one, a sequel, and a sequel. But within the universe, it's an entire series.
And you know where they came up with the multiverse? Stan Lee, to explain how come they can have all these superheroes, because most of this stuff took place in New York, because Stan Lee was in New York. And it was like, well, how can you have all these different superheroes fighting all these things and they don't know about each other? And that's when he came up with the idea of the multiverse, was that, yes, it all happens in New York, but not all these people live in the same universe. And then he started the idea of the multiverse. Sometimes their universes cross over. So some superheroes knew about other superheroes, which then became your Avengers and those type of series where the people were what they call mashups and stuff like that, superhero mashups. So in order to explain the idea, how can you have Iron Man destroying the city, and you have Spider-Man destroying the city, and you have the Hulk destroying the city, but yet none of these people know each other. And it was like, okay, well, to explain it, he came up with the idea of the multiverse, which was that each one of these superheroes live in their own universe. So, and every now and then he crossed the universes or melded the universe, where you did have Iron Man who now knew Spider-Man, or you did have, somebody going after the Hulk. You had the Fantastic Four have to jump in to fight the Hulk because, there's nobody else strong enough to battle him.
Yeah. So would you say from a writer's perspective that when you start writing, do you need to go into it knowing if it's going to have a sequel or if it's going to be a series, or do you just need to write? And then if you need to split the book because there's too many numbers or, it's too long, then be okay with the possibility of there being a sequel? Or does it not really affect your writing? You just need to write, and then whatever a sequel, series, trilogy, whatever, comes about, it comes about. Like what in the mindset should a writer kind of consider?
I think that depends. Go ahead, Athena.
Well, sometimes what happens, it actually comes to you as you're writing that first story. So when you're writing the first story, you realize that your threads are going into so many places that they could fit all in one book, and that could be massive. Whereas the way your threads are going, it's better to split them up to create different sections within your story. And then you work with your arc, that there is a continuous arc between all your works, but they are works within themselves as well.
I look at it as dependent upon your type of writer. If you are a planner, then you're probably going to plot out your series in advance. So like for the Killer series, I plotted out the fact that I was going to have 4 books, and these were going to be the different books: Killer with a Heart, Killer with 3 Heads. Sometimes the titles don't come to you, but the story does. And then for the Gemstone series, I actually, like Athena said, started writing the story, and halfway through the story realized that this was going to be a much bigger story, and therefore it was going to be a series. And that was more like the plotter type of Pantsir's type of storyline, because I didn't really have a concrete story in mind. I was just writing this mermaid pirate love story that was going to take place during this time. And at some point, I realized that the story was growing bigger than one book will contain. And people will want to know, well, what happened to the dragons? How did the dragons get captured? And why was it such a bad idea to release them? And so therefore, ergo, here comes a series.
Yes, exactly like that. That is how it happens.
Nice, that makes sense. So what would you guys say the most popular genre is that has sequels or a series in it? Would any genre, or there's some genres that
Fantasy.
okay, I was
Fantasy,
gonna say more
definitely.
favorable. See, I was gonna say, I guess in terms of like a series or sequel, I was gonna say romance, but you know, like the steamy exotic romance, not just
That
contemporary.
used to be the case. That used to be the case that people wrote. But see, those are more sequels than a
Okay.
series
Okay.
because it's pretty much the same story or same storyline that they're talking about. So
Mhm.
it's the first person in the story, then maybe the daughter or maybe somebody else, or about a place, you know. So you have a story about, you know, what was it called? Bridgerton, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And you can see where that's going to be a sequel because they're going to come back and they're going to talk about this romance and blah, blah, blah in this time period. A lot of
Yes,
times it's
within
also a
that
time
family.
period.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense because you know, then you like I guess within that same time period, maybe not, you know, like Pride and Prejudice, right? That's not
Mm.
a series or a sequel or anything like that. It's a standalone, fantastic movie. I did not appreciate that movie or book until I was older because I used to make fun of my sisters and my mom. They would always watch that and stuff. But so, what would you classify like Anne of Green Gables? That name it just popped in my mind because my mom was watching it. So
Say that again. Which one?
Anne of Green
And of Green
Gables.
Gables. It's a sweet.
Is that would you consider it a romance?
It can be. Yes, there is a slight romance in it, but because of the time it was written, it was very, how can I say, clean and sweet.
Right. Yeah.
You know, the romance is approached from a very platonic point of view, let's say. I mean,
Okay.
in those days, people could hardly touch each other's hands. You
Right.
couldn't visit each other without chaperones and those kind of things. So the romance has to fit the time period. Whereas in modern day time, everybody is free to, you know, they own their own agents, men, women, everybody is equal. So we all have freedoms. Whereas a time period, there were norms that you had to follow, you know, your society dictated certain things, you know, so some things were allowed, some things were not allowed. So you have to follow that.
And that's the
Okay.
interesting thing about writing is that a lot of time things change. You know, what was once considered a romance is now
Yes.
just considered a love story or a woman's fiction because of the changes in time. What was once
Mhm.
considered science fiction is now considered fantasy or something like that because the science has kind of like been drawn out and now it's more fantastical rather than scientific driven. So when you have
Yes.
these, when you start talking about sequels and stuff like that, and series, like that's why we said fantasy lends itself to series very well because you can continue on that story really, really easily. Whereas with a science fiction, it's kind of like the beginning and the end. You know, this science, whatever had happened, and these are the consequences of it. And you might get a sequel out of it was okay, after this happened, this will happen. But then you come to the brick wall where, all right, so we have the science. Let's take nuclear power, for example. You write a story about somebody, you know, using nuclear power somehow badly. Okay. And those things happen. And then you know, so that's one story. And then there's the aftermath of what has happened. And
Right.
that's that story. And now you're pretty much out of it. You
Okay.
had the experience and you had the aftermath, and now you're out of it.
Well,
Whereas
yeah.
fantasy, you can just keep going with this happened and that happened, and that causes this to happen. And now you got a whole new set of people, you know, that kind of
Yes,
thing.
science fiction can work quite well, you know, as sequels. And the perfect one to use as an example is Alien.
Yeah.
They had one, and then they saw the success of it, so they created another one, and then that was successful, so they created it, and then they kept on creating sequels, which actually turned it into a series eventually. But it was a sequel to a success that it started off with. You
Yeah,
see, so
because in
that is,
aliens, those aliens in the first one weren't the actual beings that was on that ship. You realize that in the second one, that what they found was a crashed ship. And the reason why the crashed ship was because they had those aliens on board. So they were not the original crew or whatever of that crashed ship. And then, of course, the sequel goes on with the idea that they go back to the planet and, there all kinds of crap happens. But anyway.
I need to brush up on my Alien. I need to watch that, like Alien versus Predator and stuff. I need to do that for sure.
That's a mashup of, two different horror stories.
Right, yeah.
Quite frankly, horror stories seem to go on forever. They also like to make series out of horror stories because, again, the person never dies usually in a horror story,
Yeah, it's true. They always somehow come back from the dead, That's definitely true. Well, you guys, thank you so much for explaining the difference between series and sequels, because, I am just one of those, I don't know, I would lose my head if it wasn't attached to my body, but I, couldn't figure it out. I was like, I know there's a difference. And I appreciate you guys for doing it. So you guys, this has been Readers and Writers. We are back for season 2. So we hope you have a fantastic evening and catch us all next week.